Welcome everyone to the first of 3 webinars this fall from the Gathering Place, where faith formation leaders gather, learn, share, and grow. I am Shanna P.G. Bushhart, Denominational Minister for Faith Formation for Mennonite Church USA. We're here together because we're disciples of Jesus and leaders in a church experiencing the effects of a politically polarized culture. We believe that our church is called to proclaim and be a sign of the reign of God or the government of God. So it's fitting that we would take time to explore together as leaders what that means for us in practical terms.
Yeah, as you know, this is a 3 webinar series entitled Putting Jesus on the Ballot, Anabaptism and American Politics. And obviously by the turnout, this is a topic that's everyone's wanting to explore. So we're really thrilled to have you here. Tonight's theme will be Foundations, Setting Our Theological Bearings. And we're pleased to have Scott Peterson here presenting. Scott is the the leadership pastor of Trinity Mennonite Church in Phoenix, Arizona, where he's served in that role for 5 years. There's some more information on their website, and he works alongside with Megan Larissa Good and others on their staff to lead that congregation. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Scott. Thank you, Scott, for leading the series.
I'm excited to be talking with you today. This conversation is really dear to me. It's actually one of the core things that brought me into an Anabaptist faith in particular. This conversation about Anabaptism and politics was always uncomfortable when it first came up way back when I was in seminary, because it turns out, I found out later, that Mennonites tend to be good people. And good people were taught at a young age, you don't talk about politics. And so it turned out this was an awfully awkward conversation to have over and over and over again. But people were talking. They were talking about politics, just not necessarily openly or with people with whom they may disagree. Now, tonight is probably going to be one of those experiences as well, a little bit, because we are talking politics. You will likely have some discomfort, and you will almost certainly disagree at some point. I'm going to encourage you to stick around, though, not just tonight, but for the rest of the series as well. As we go through this series, they build on each other. Each 3 of these weeks builds on the one previously. And even if you walk away frustrated that you didn't get all the answers tonight, what I can probably say is great, because tonight we're really just getting started. You're likely to walk away with that discomfort that hopefully gets scratched at the next one and then gets anchored into action by the 3rd time we get together. This topic as an overview, you've probably seen why we need to talk about it. You've probably witnessed it yourselves in your conversations with friends and family, but most likely you've seen it online. If you've got a Facebook account, or if you delve into the depths of that infamous opinionated page of Twitter, you've probably seen where this conversation of politics and Jesus can go. In our churches, it seems often that whatever is happening in the political realm at large is simply mirrored. The fighting back and forth of different ideologies no longer has a ring of Jesus about it at all, in fact. In many ways, our conversations miss the uniquely Anabaptist theology that I think anchors what we do. When I hear the arguments that are being thrown around, too often they just sound like mainline churches on the left and evangelical churches on the right. So before we go any further with that, though, I want to introduce you to a few wills and won'ts for this. You're probably already concerned that I'm going to say something about a political opinion and make it sound like it's the Jesus opinion. And so I want to give you these wills and won'ts for the evening that will hopefully set your mind a little more at ease. First off, I will be pushing against partisan positions. I will be absolutely pushing against ideas of partisan politics as if that is a holy position to hold. But I won't be promoting partisan positions on the opposite side. If you feel pressure of me pushing against you, know that I'm not trying to push you into another camp. I'm just trying to push you out of identifying primarily as a camper. I will be explaining how Christians can agree on theology and disagree on politics. Now, this is really going to come next week, but in this series, or next month, but in this series, I will be explaining how Christians can agree on theology and disagree on politics, but I won't minimize the inherent differences in those ideas. These political differences can be huge, and yet I will show how there's a way that our theology actually allows for differences. I will help you be consistent and introspective about your political opinions. At least that's the goal. I won't be giving you ammunition to use against your political enemies. So if you're concerned that what you're going to get is some sort of position place where other people are going to know how to talk to you now to convince you of their views, that's not what's going to happen here. There's too much of that already out in the world. I will be challenging you to consider and practice your politics differently, but I won't be arguing for abandoning the political world. Early on in this conversation tonight, you might feel like that's where we're heading. I can guarantee you I will not be arguing for abandoning the political world. All right, so now that we have those wills and won'ts out of the way, I think it's really important that we move into the conversation of what it is that where we currently are in our political conversations in the church. Where are we? How did we get here? And why is it we seem to stay here? When I first moved into to the Anabaptist world, I was drawn in by a different way to do church, by a different way to be a Christian. See, I was raised in a Baptist church, and the political infighting was palatable. One side on the left said this is the way Jesus would do it, and one side on the right said this is the way Jesus would do it, and they constantly were in battles with one another. To say that it was difficult, well, that would be an understatement. It was soul-wrenching to see people who said that they had the blood of Christ as a unifier, and yet it seemed like primarily it was the images of political parties that held them. When I got into an Anabaptist, well, by the time I got to an Anabaptist seminary, I had the expectation that Mennonites would be somewhat free of that tension because they would have found another way to engage. And I'll be honest, I kind of viewed the Mennonite church as Camelot, right? Like it is the greener pastures for me. And what I found out was MCUSA, like every other denomination, it's full of people. And the problem with people is they tend to be people. They still have the same kind of fighting and difficulty that happens. And I found that some of the tension that was happening here was left over from other conversations that have been happening around the church outside Anabaptism. So let's simply get into it then. Why did we get here? And why do we stay here? I'd like to share a couple of slides with you to really give you an image of that. I am convinced that part of the reason that we got here and why we stay here is because when we look at a broken world, in response to a broken world, we try to apply the strongest healing power we know, Christ. As Christians, this is a central idea of what we believe is that Jesus is actually the power for salvation and hope in our world. And so in applying it, we're essentially saying, look, God cares about this brokenness. God wants change in this brokenness. So we end up with ideas of what would Jesus do in these circumstances. Now the question might seem simple, but the answers we come up with are divisive. Think about it this way. When I look at social media, I get to see funny little memes. Now this guy in particular, he's my favorite Jesus meme, okay? He's called Peaking Jesus, and he tends to pop in now and then on my feed, and he's usually coupled with some sort of funny photograph of like someone doing something they really shouldn't be doing, and he pops in saying, I saw that. Now, it's cute, of course, and it's funny that Jesus, he's watching you, so be careful. But the other day, I saw this particular meme creep in to my feed that said, "Still wondering what Jesus would do?" And Peking Jesus makes a little comment. "I wouldn't be more concerned with protecting guns than protecting the lives of children." Now, the point of this, of course, is to make a theological statement, not just a cute little meme. How do we end up with a place where this sort of comment would make sense in our political discourse? Well, we don't actually mean that just because Jesus would say this, that's the end of the conversation. The person who posted this was making a political statement, because actually every Christian I know would say that Jesus absolutely would be comfortable making that statement. I wouldn't be more concerned with protecting guns than protecting the lives of children. If it's just that, without any baggage whatsoever, and that's all the statement is, of course Jesus would say it. Of course Jesus would say it. But that's not why this was posted. What they really wanted Jesus to be saying was something else. I would support gun control legislation. What they really wanted Jesus to be saying is to move beyond clearly some sort of statement that Jesus would make in regards to whether or not guns are more important than kids, and move on to a statement of political action. This sort of imagery, though, when carried through on other ways that Jesus talked, doesn't seem to be something that comes up very often. I've been surprised if you were to put this thing up there, you might all agree that yes, Jesus would say, "I wouldn't look at another woman with lust in my heart." Well, I think clearly that Jesus could make this statement. This fits the image of the Sermon on the Mount, of what Jesus had to say about all of the many things that Christians are called to do. But I don't think we would actually look to that as a political philosophy, which would tell us I would support anti-lust legislation. Or if we were to keep going with that, I would never respond to violence with violence. As an Anabaptist, this absolutely is a way of understanding the way of Jesus. But would we want to say this? I would support legislation to make all violent actions illegal in all circumstances. Now, when I ask this, I think it's important to ask a follow-up question. If we even believe that we should do this, that this should be the way for Christians to act when we're involved with the government, that we should try and pass legislation like this, how would it be enforced? I mean, the government couldn't use violence to enforce it. You couldn't use force to enforce it at all if all violent actions were made illegal in all circumstances. So why is it we use Jesus in some instances to make declarations of what the law should be in our land, but in others we bypass it completely? Think about another one. I wouldn't intentionally deceive others. This is very clearly a Jesus idea. I wouldn't intentionally deceive others. I would support legislation to make all deception illegal. Well, how far? How far do you think that would go? Would we apply that standard even? Why do we not see Jesus memes on our feed like this? I mean, the reason why we invoke Jesus is exactly what was being said before, that we are trying to find the strongest possible, the absolute strongest possible means for fixing a broken world. And so it makes sense that we would look to the area that we found the most hope, that we look to Christ. But we are so deeply inconsistent with applying the Christian faith as an actual guide to how we do politics. And most of us would agree that you can't easily do so in a way that would be genuinely faithful, because the teachings of Christ seem to run into barriers if we were to try to legislate them as law. So what do? Do we just abandon the whole thing as a response? Well, that doesn't make any sense. If we say that Jesus cares about our world, cares about the brokenness that exists, and there's a real power out there that is engaged in both healing it, but also causing some of that brokenness, the power of our governments, abandoning it, following through with what, well, at one point at least, is the Amish option, doesn't seem like an ideal choice. So what do? We don't get to choose the pure Jesus option. It doesn't seem to be offered to us anymore. So instead, we choose a political package. We choose the red or the blue, the left or the right. And we hold that political package, and then we come to find out that we went in there choosing just one thing, but in the end, it came with a bunch of other stuff that we had to hold on to as well. You see, our political camps, our parties that we're in, don't just have one view that we might call Christian. They have a bunch of views that are attached to them that we may not fully agree with, but we stick ourselves in those groups anyway. If you want to know where this comes from, why we're okay with having theological ideas that don't line up with our political ideas, and yet we still support fully these political groups, you can probably, well, you can blame it on a guy named Reinhold Niebuhr. Now, I'm not going to get too much into the history and all of the depths of Reinhold's theology, but the guy's name is Reinhold Niebuhr, and he has had a massive impact on our Christian faith as it exists in the political realm. Reinhold developed this idea. He really thoroughly fleshed out the idea of Christian realism. It's a type of real politics. And what that means is essentially that Christianity, when it comes to working things out with the government, just can't be so pure. It just has to recognize that not everything is going to line up the way that would make sense in a kingdom of God theology. He was accepted on the right and the left as someone who had great ideas for how to make the Christian faith functional in a government. He really emphasized the idea that sin is a social reality and not merely a personal one, which means it should be engaged with social structures. Most people in almost every Christian tradition at this point accept this idea. But then he went further to say, ideas of the kingdom of God through governments are essentially utopian and impractical because government systems don't work that way. Politics just can't be pure. There are no clean hands when it comes to the government. And that Christians ought to use faith as a moral guide, but need to be willing to make practical compromises. In terms of Christian realism, the idea of how Christian faith impacts the government is essentially only so far as makes sense with the way that government acts, meaning bring in your Jesus, just not too much. Now, this makes the political packages idea really more palatable. We can handle a lot more ideas of some of the things that are on the right and some of the things that are on the left. May not line up with our faith perfectly, but what are you going to do? These are the packages we have. One on the right, one on the left, and we just kind of hold on to the ones that are there. Now, if you're like me, this is already making you a little bit squirmy. Because as Anabaptists, we don't really have a real strong affection for the idea of a compromised faith as being some sort of beautiful thing. Instead, we have a commitment to the way of Christ, regardless of the outcome, as an image of what it means to be an Anabaptist Christian. When we hear the words of Mr. Niebuhr, well, it should make you quite uncomfortable. In 1940, he wrote, "Ambiguous methods are required for the ambiguities of history. Let those who are revolted by such ambiguities have the decency and consistency to retire to the monastery where medieval perfectionists found their asylum." He essentially said, look, yeah, it's going to get ugly. That's politics. If you want to be a perfectionist and think the kingdom of God is coming in your actions alone, then just disappear into your church. Don't engage. This legacy is, well, to say that it's been large just simply is not fair because it's bigger than just large. The legacy of Reinhold Niebuhr I would in fact argue that it is one of the largest ethical conversations. This is Reinhold, by the way. It is one of the largest ethical conversations of practical politics in faith that has ever existed, and books come out about him regularly still about his impact. And why we end up with these type of packages of mixed ideas. Here's this statement. I'll read it again for you. Ambiguous methods are required for the ambiguities of history. Let those who are revolted by such ambiguities have the decency and consistency to retire to the monastery where medieval perfectionists found their asylum. His legacy, by the way, can be seen in these two gentlemen who both list this theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, as one of the most important influences in their life for how Christian faith impacts government. It really doesn't matter which side of things you're on when it comes to the right and the left in our political society. The image of being willing to say, hey, just a little Jesus is enough. It's pervasive. Now, Anabaptists tend not to handle this kind of inconsistency well, as I've already mentioned. See, we have a high priority of following Jesus, and we don't want Jesus to just be okay with what we believe. We don't want Jesus to just be okay with us putting packages together. We really want Jesus to be fully on whatever political side we have. So we end up having these beautiful packages with little Jesuses on our side. It seems that wherever we turn, Jesus agrees with us and disagrees with those people who are in a political camp different from us. No matter how many times we work through the issues, amazingly, Jesus is practically one of our party. Now, maybe you're one of the people who looks at this and already knows there's something wrong here. This doesn't make sense. There's surely no way that Jesus simply fits well into the political systems of our day. So before we move on with the conversation then, if that's the case, why are we doing this? Why can't we be consistent in our application of Christ's call to the political systems of our day? Why can't we apply this evenly, well, or consistently? And what would it mean if we were to? I want to see if Michael has any questions that if we want to answer some of those before we move on here.
Yeah, so as you can see, right now there's no questions that are coming from the chat feed, so I would just keep...
We're going to keep rolling, which is good because we're getting to the part of the stuff. All of that was a lead up to the real conversation that I think is the most important. So if we're divided right now, if we're stuck in a system that is divided with Christians on one side and the other basically saying Jesus is on my team, and battling it out in kind of the social conversations in our churches, how do we move forward with a conversation that says, recognizing it's just not true? We're not being consistent. This isn't actually how this is playing out. Well, I'd recommend that we look at this table real quick. I'm going to share this page with you one more time because I want you to ask yourself, if I were to say that Jesus, every choice I'm making in my political perspective has its foundation in the teaching of Christ, I want you to look at just these few ideas. Some of these are right, some of these are left, and some of these are, well, may not be identifiable in either, really. And I want you to ask the question of yourself. Am I truly making this decision on these political issues based primarily from the start with the message and teachings of Christ? How many political views do we hold that truly come from trying to implement the way of Jesus? And then, this is the part that really ends up mattering a lot in the conversation. If we can say yes, even if we can say yes, the political opinions I hold come directly from the teachings of Jesus and trying to implement those. How would Jesus feel about us forcing non-Christians to follow those ways? Now, if my hope is right now you are confused a little bit about how there's any way to do politics with Jesus' faith, with the Jesus faith, with the Jesus movement, because the real question of the night is going to be, what is the foundational movement of Christianity, and why does it seem to conflict in this way with implementing a political position? I'm going to make this argument, and I am very excited to hear your thoughts on it, because this next piece is pretty much the center of the entire structure of what we're talking about over these 3 weeks. So I want to hear your engagement. When we get down to the questions part, please start thinking already, and feel free to push back. Most of the high level answers we get to that really seem to hit home is because someone asked a question to push back a bit on what's being said. Why can't we be consistent with our political application of Christ's call? It's because the means of Christ are incompatible with the means of government. The means of Christ are incompatible with the means of government. So if we look at the foundational images of what Anabaptist Christianity is, we're going to see this. Now, this is where I get some pushback from people on, well, who are you to define Anabaptism? It could mean whatever we build it to mean, which is partially true. We can go down the road of saying, well, whatever we develop it to mean is just what Anabaptism is. But at some point, it becomes non-functional to walk that road. At some point, if we just become nicer Lutherans than with our political view or with our theological views, then we should just call ourselves Lutherans. If our political views if our theological views are no longer different in any way from other traditions, then the term Anabaptist becomes useless. So this is a functional description of what makes some of our beliefs different. Now, we can obviously get a much, much larger definition of Anabaptism, but these are some of the things that really make us unique in the Christian traditions. So we have the statement that all Christians have, Kyrios Jesus, which is just the Greek statement of Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Lord. Now, for the Christian church, historically, it's always been the declaration that Jesus is Lord is the primary way that we say that we are followers of Jesus of Nazareth. But for Anabaptists, we have a really unique way of doing that, because we say we follow him even in the hard stuff. And that almost always comes out to the image of nonviolence and non-coercion. So it almost comes down to the deepest levels of when Jesus went to the cross, we actually believe that we might be called along the same path. And that we do so fully committed to what Jesus is teaching, in that our enemies should be loved just as much as our friends, and we should be willing to lay our life down. We also then believe in non-coercion. This is an invitational faith, right? We believe that Christ invites us to take on the yoke that he's offering. That we believe that Jesus is inviting people into a community, not forcing them. There's no coercion. I mean, we don't even baptize babies because we want to have them make their own decisions. So we have a strong non-coercive faith that is, and nonviolent faith that is centered around Jesus being the central character of everything we do. Now, what this means really uniquely for us is not just this nonviolent stuff, right? It's not just the non-coercion, but that Anabaptist Christianity is a means-based faith, not an ends-based faith. You may never have heard this idea before, but think about it for a minute. We really are a means-based faith, not an ends-based faith. What this means in actual, how it actually plays out is that when we talk about justice, when we talk about peace, when we talk about discernment or even community, we're not talking about what we can get out of these things. We're talking about how we do them. We do them sacrificially. We do them with a willingness to serve. This is a means-based trajectory, not an ends-based trajectory. This is what makes us completely unique from nearly every other Christian tradition right now, which would say oftentimes that depending on what the ends are, the means are variable. In our tradition, we can actually be in a spot where you can follow Christ all the way to the loss of our lives, and we'd say that we did the right thing if what we're doing is being faithful to the way of Jesus. Now, the best way for me to explain this really is not to keep hammering away at the theology, but to read a little story for you from Scripture. It's the temptations of Jesus. These are the three temptations that happen when Christ is drawn to the wilderness. And so we're going to read these three sections here. In Matthew 4, it says, "Then the Spirit led Jesus up into the wilderness so that the devil might tempt him. After Jesus had fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, he was starving. The tempter came to him and said, Since you are God's son, command these stones to become bread." Jesus replied, "It is written, people won't live only by bread, but by every word spoken by God." You see, Jesus needs to be sustained. That's not a question. The question is, what are the means by which he will be sustained? Jesus needs to be sustained. The question for him are, what are the means by which he will be sustained? The next story, well, actually, this is the third part of that story, tells us this: the devil brought him to a very high mountain that showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. He said, "I'll give you all these if you bow down and worship me." Jesus responded, "Go away, Satan, because it is written, you will worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Now, Jesus is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and the imagery of what Christ will rule over is all creation. This isn't even a question of whether or not he was worthy of ruling these things. Our own theology says yes. This isn't a question of the ends. It's a question of the means. How does he go about doing it? We find this again in the other portion of this story. After that, the devil brought him into the holy city and stood him at the highest point of the temple. He said to him, "Since you are God's son, throw yourself down, for it is written, I will command my angels concerning you, and they will take you up in their hands, so that you won't hit your foot on a stone." Jesus replied, "Again, it is written, don't test the Lord your God." There is no question that Jesus needed to be faithful to the Father. And there's no question that Jesus needed the faithfulness of the Father. The question is only, what are the means by which he would show that he trusted in the Father, that the Father would be faithful? And he doesn't do it by throwing himself down like this, saying that God will never allow harm to come his way. His actual faithfulness goes much further, and it takes him all the way to the cross. He follows it to the very end, not to find his rescue from the suffering, but find redemption for his faithfulness. This is an image of a means-based faith, not an ends-based faith. Anabaptist Christianity, at its very heart, is exactly that. It is being faithful to Christ, regardless of the outcome. This is a completely different structure than how any government has ever been structured. In fact, the kind of scaffolding that this puts up for how we can go out making choices for our life is antithetical to the structures of government. So I'd like to pause for a moment here and see if, Michael, I actually don't see the chat, so feel free to let me know if we've got anything we want to talk about.
I'm reading. So there was a comment about what you were presenting that I started to read. So I think I'll go, if it's okay, I'll go ahead and do that. Just read this comment and then you can respond to it.
Okay.
The primary contrast that you are drawing between the means of Christ and the means of government is that Anabaptist Christians do not use force to impose their will on others, and government agents do. However, this seems to assume that coercion is something that you consciously impose on others, But in our current political climate, those who are privileged, e.g. citizens, especially white citizens of the most powerful country on earth, can coerce others without intending to, simply due to our status. For example, if a Mennonite missionary goes to another country and is captured by a terrorist group, then there may be public outcry for the government to use every means to rescue that person, even though he or she did not ask for it. Thus, if Navy SEALs come in and kill the terrorist to save the Mennonite missionary, doesn't the Mennonite bear some responsibility for this? And doesn't this mean that we have to be engaged in the question of how to use our force responsibly?
All right, I'm going to make this one actually fairly simple, because the two primary questions is, do we bear some responsibility in this particularly unique situation? I'm going to answer some of that by moving into the conversation of what government does, but I'll start with simply saying yes, we do bear some responsibility. And secondarily, does this mean that we have to be engaged in the question of how to use the force responsibly? I'd be real cautious about the term responsibly, and we're going to get to that soon. But I will also say, yes. Remember, I am not arguing that we shouldn't be involved. At this point, the most important thing that I am arguing is that our way of defining ethics is means-based more than ends-based. And in that being the case, it is impossible to ask government to do the same. So we can do something about it, but we cannot be asking government to change that mode, because no government can be a follower of Christ. So I'm going to, this is a good question, and it moves right into the next section. So I'm going to move into this, and maybe this will answer more about that. The reason why we can't seem to bring these things together, and I'm going to bring us back to my screen here for a second for this. The reason why we can't bring these two ways together, of the way of Christ, which is the way of the Christian, and the way of the government, is because the only means that the government has are antichrist. The only means that the government has are antichrist. Now, it's important to say, why is that? And that is because I'm going to find it right there. It's because when we say we're Anabaptist Christians, one of the unique things about our faith tradition includes these: nonviolence, non-coercion, essentially this invitational imagery. Now, how many of you feel that governments are particularly invitational? Right? How many of you feel that governments are just waiting for you to decide whether you want to obey the laws of the land? The point is that governments, all governments, hold their authority exclusively through violence. All governments hold their authority exclusively through violence. There are good governments and there are bad governments. But you've probably seen some governments that are particularly good. And I know that because you probably have a political opinion, and there's probably been a time in your life, well, maybe not. Maybe you're one of those people who this hasn't happened for you. There's probably been a time in your life where your political opinion happened to line up somewhat with the political power of the day. Maybe not fully, but somewhat. And you might have called that government good. And then there are bad governments, and you know exactly what they are, because you're like me, you're like every other person with a political opinion. That government didn't line up with what you thought was good. So there are good governments and there are bad governments, but all governments, good or bad, have only one tool, and that's violence. It's the only method by which governments exist. They are a fallen power, and they use fallen means. Every government action, regardless of how large or small it may be, carries with it a threat of violent action. This is where I tend to get the most pushback, actually. Right here is where it gets deep, because this can be hard for us to fully embrace. It can feel like, no, I know government does good things. I'm not arguing the government doesn't do good things. I'm just arguing that in order to do those good things, the government must threaten violence. Now, this is easy to see if there's a terrorist attack or something. It's easy to see how there's a violent action that we could expect from the government, and a violent response in that way. But it actually comes through in all the ways we wouldn't normally see. Well, think about this. How many of you, this is a lot easier, by the way, if I could see you in person. So I'm just going to imagine you're in the room with me. How many of you like bridges? Like the existence of bridges? How many of you are glad that when you need to travel over a large body of water that's dry, that's wide enough for you to build a bridge over, that you could just drive over it because society has built bridges? Now me, for one, I'm from California, right? I think the Golden Gate Bridge is one of the most lovely places to visit in San Francisco area. I love that place. I like bridges. I think they're an important part of our society. I'm even such a fan of bridges, I'm willing to give freely of my money toward that. In fact, I know that when my taxes go toward building a bridge, I'm happy. Now, that makes sense. I'm guessing many of you would say, okay, when I think about it that way, yes, I am pleased that I have tax dollars that go toward bridges. So if someone decided to come to your house and specifically, instead of just some information through the mail that said you owe money, what if someone knocked on your door and said, you owe this much for your taxes? Well, you might think, I like my bridges, I'm going to pay. What do you think about your neighbor, though? What do you think about your neighbor who happens to not care so much about bridges? For whatever reason, let's say you have a neighbor who doesn't want to pay for bridges. You have a neighbor who's wholly opposed to bridges. Now, I have no reason why this would be, but they're wholly opposed to bridges. They don't want to pay. Do you feel comfortable going to your neighbor's house and making your neighbor pay? We've got only one option if government is involved, and that is they make it a law and they enforce the law. Maybe they simply say, we're going to we're going to pull money out of his bank account, right? Well, okay, so he doesn't have a bank account. Let's say maybe we're gonna garnish his wages, so he only gets paid under the table now. In the end, if the government makes a law that they are going to enforce, their final action is not going to be mere coercion, which is what all of those things were. It's going to be violence. It's going to be, we come to your home and take you to a court, and if you don't want to go, we make you. I mean, most of us would agree that it's perfectly reasonable to step out and say, we love bridges, we will vote in favor of taxes for bridges. But how many of us would be willing to go to our neighbor's house and be the ones to drag them out and take them to court because they didn't pay for the bridges? Every single law that we enact, regardless of how good the law is, includes the threat that if the law is broken, violence will occur. And it is, at its functional basis, an agreement by society that yes, government institutions, you are free to act violently in these ways. Now I'm going to push this further because this is the place where because I get the most pushback, I want to give these examples. I've been told by others that they don't want that to happen, that governments don't have to use violence, that there are other ways. And there are some other ways that can be done, particularly in small community situations where they commit to one another. But even in those situations, if one person opts out completely, what are you going to do? If they opt out of saying, I'm not going to participate in a nonviolent method, what are you going to do? And more importantly, if we take these nonviolent things and we could say government doesn't have to act violently, so the entire government in a federal scale and at a national level never again engages in any kind of violence, how long does that government actually exist, and how does it call itself a government? You can pretty much guarantee that the next day, if they wholly abandon any kind of violence, that the very next day, all it takes is one person to walk in there and say, I'm in charge now, because they're willing to act in violence. Governments, there is no government that doesn't act violently, because governments that would choose to not act violently are done. That's the end. Governments close down with the violent government that comes in. The reality is that flat out governments have no choice but to act violently in all situations. Now, I would wager that most of us would say, how is it that paying for a playground in the middle of my city, which needs space for the community, is violence? Well, it's not. And this is why it's so important to get what I'm saying at the depths of it. That's not violence. But how you get the money for it is one of the lowest levels of violence, but it can be, and that's just taxation, right? It also comes to what are the rules set up when we create these playgrounds? Who's in, who's out? What do you do when someone breaks the rules at these places? I'm not even arguing these things are bad. Remember, I think government can do good things, but they can only do these things by threatening violence. Now, this is one of the places where people might say, yeah, but how's that different from church? Churches can vote. We know churches can act violently. As Anabaptists, we have our own Munster rebellions that I don't want to get into, but we know that churches can do these things, and churches vote and they enforce rules. Isn't that just the same thing? Well, there's a little bit of a difference there, and one is that if my church were to vote, if we were to get together and my church were to vote and decide whether or not, let's say they just decided from now on they're meeting on Sunday nights instead of Sunday mornings, and I hated the idea. Well, no one can make me go. That's not the case for governments. In fact, at their very base level, the whole point of a government system is not to enforce the rules on people who already want to obey the rules. The whole point of a government system is to enforce the rules on people who don't. If government were merely trying to enforce the rules on the people who already want to follow them, it would be useless. Quite literally, I mean, there's just no use to doing that. I don't need to make people do things that they are already doing and want to do. It is intentionally about holding people together who don't want to be in circumstances which they disagree. I'd like to take a break on that and see if we've got any questions, Michael.
All right, so I remember to unmute my mic and turn on my video. Yes, you have some questions coming in on this one. So first question, what are you defining as the role of government? Yes.
Okay, so that is literally the most important topic at the start of the next webinar. So I'm going to have to decline to answer that directly because it will come up. There is a role for government, and we will examine it. And hopefully that'll give us a chance to know of how we actually can step forward and engage in government, but I can't get into that tonight.
Okay. Next question. What about the concept of Rousseau's social contract?
Okay, so ideas of social contracts, any of them, essentially say that we're basically together and with the agreement that as we exist in a community, we make decisions for that community. The very reason that a government exists is because society wants that government to exist. Which that's fine, and Rousseau isn't the only one who played with that idea. In many ways, the American government is structured in that same way, right? A government for the people, by the people, of the people, all of these things. That's not untrue. My main point, though, is that the reason why government is violent is because sometimes someone disagrees with whatever that contract is. Someone disagrees. They don't want that contract anymore. They want out. And they want to do things their own way. And government's role is right then very clear to stop them from doing it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. The next one. How would you respond to this quote from John Howard Yoder? Quote, "It is widely agreed that the use of the sword, the ultimate capacity to appeal to the power to coerce, is the sine qua non, i.e. indispensable definition of the state. If there is no coercive power, there is anarchy. Over and against this kind of definition, the political pacifist argues that the police power is not the center but the far edge, the ultimate ratio, the last resort of any wholesome human community. The health and existence of a community depend on maintaining the latency of that power." And that's from Nevertheless, page 44. And as you answer, I'll just put, it says, "I agree with you fundamentally, and I think you're doing great. I'm using this opportunity to play devil's advocate and to ask the questions that haunt the corners of my own theology."
Oh, great. Great. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. That's the sort of thing I want to hear. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that, and so I'd probably want to read more of it. This is one of the areas that Yoder talked quite a bit about in different areas, and I think that it's really important to engage because we haven't had as much conversation around the politics of Anabaptism as it applies to government, because those politics and government are not exactly the same thing. But so we haven't had that conversation well in a long time, unfortunately, in the Mennonite Church. But here's what I'll say with that. Yeah, the political system, the power of a political system, of a government system to inflict violence it should be, I'm trying to avoid getting into what I'm going really far into at the next webinar. There is a limitation to it as part of its role. So I'm going to leave that part there, but I am going to say there is an indispensableness to that as well. And that is what I'm trying to say with the very definition of government being a body in which acts using violence as its pure definition. Now, that's a baseline. The point of this is to say, at least the way it sounded from that quote, is that at the furthest edge, like we want them to not use it whenever they can get away with not using it, which is absolutely true, and that is also going to come up with that sort of limits to what government can and can't do based on its role. Or should and shouldn't do. That's better based on its role. But those limits matter in terms of they are the edges, and it should be only used when absolutely necessary. Sorry if that sounds too vague. It's just I'm trying to avoid the longer conversation because it will move us into a whole new arena of what is the role of government if these things are true. The key things I want to say tonight is clarify that the Christians have a calling of nonviolence, Anabaptist Christians have a calling of nonviolence and non-coercion, and government can never act in a way that is nonviolent and non-coercive. So even when, and it does matter to that question, even when the government acts in a way that isn't directly violent, that isn't directly limiting the actions of other people with violence, every action it's doing includes a threat of violence to maintain whatever that structure is to whatever the minority within that group is. And usually it would be some sort of political minority, whatever the minority that doesn't agree with whatever the decision is, no matter what the political decision is in any circumstance. There's always a consistent, you could call it latent, you could call it static, but there's this constant threat of violence against anyone who would disagree with whatever the decision is made, no matter how small or large.
All right, a few more. Question, don't we also put a lot of emphasis on ends, e.g. resurrection, eternal life, the kingdom of God, shalom, etc.? And doesn't the desire for these ends motivate the purpose for our means?
Oh, that is a fantastic question. Yeah, no, absolutely. In some ways you could argue that that because we view those ends, that's part of how we define why we're completing these means. And that might be the case, but that's a why scenario. That isn't a definition of what is acceptable. So the difference between the ends and means conversation is as long as we can get to those ends, however we get there is reasonable. And the Christian faith says that you can't get there without specific means, or at least an Anabaptist way says you may not be able to get there without specific means. I don't want to, theologically, that can get really weird real quick. So I'll be real cautious about that part. But when we're saying like the goal is some sort of ends of resurrection or eternal life imagery, what we're saying is there are particular means that are actually tied to that, and that you cannot escape these means. They are the center point. Like this is what it's about. If you do this, you get that sort of thing. And that is unique because in many ways, this is different from Reformed theology, which has a lot more emphasis specifically on ends, and that means are far less important because they would argue instead of the means being the center, and by completing these, we are fulfilling that faithfulness to Christ. There would be the argument that it would be, this is going to get deep theology, so I'm going to touch on it real quick, that instead it would be that if you are going to get there, you just simply will fulfill the means, not that you should fulfill the means. Okay, so that already makes sense why theology can be a boring subject, because I'm slightly annoyed at myself. But I mean, I do love talking about that, but it's a unique thing around Mennonites is that we have a history that says you can't merely say you believe it, and you can't merely say you want that ends. Your life has to reflect a very particular commitment to a means. And so, well, it's not some sort of grace and works. It shouldn't be seen as like a duality or some sort of competition there. It is an integration that says it's not just that the ends are out there and there are multiple ways to get there. It says that the means are the focus either way.
Yeah.
I hope that helped without being too theologically boring.
No. Yeah. Another question then related. Also, wouldn't shunning a la Matthew 18 be a type of coercion? That question was asked, and there's an indication you answered it by a comment also.
Okay. Well, that is good because yeah, there's a both and there. There is a level of that you could argue is coercion, and in that scenario, the version of coercion that is pointed toward is, of course, redemption, right? The imagery is in fact says you should treat, the worst case scenario says treat them like an unbeliever, which is like invite them to faith in Christ, right? So this has a redemptive quality, but also there is that shunning scenario, even if there is, that shunning scenario never ends, at least it shouldn't in any way, end in any kind of violent action, because there is no threat of that. And in the church, particularly in the Anabaptist church, since the beginning, there was the point of you choose to participate and belong. And that makes it very distinct. And I get where the coercion piece of that comes from, like the social type of coercion, but there is no coercion that is violent in its nature. It is still invitational. You're still invited to participate in something.
Okay. A few more. One is an echo of a previous question about the ends, and adds that perhaps the difference is that we are an ends-based faith, but believe that the ends have already been inaugurated and so are to be lived out now. So the means and ends of Jesus should coexist as much as possible in the community of faith. That's more of a comment than a question. And then a quote from Shanna. Here's a quote that illustrates that the means matter, or the means are the ends. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way.
That's probably one of the best. That's a great job throwing that in there, because that is the point. Is that we cannot work any way toward that in a fallen world. There is no way to actually say we complete peace in this world. Mm-hmm. Right? That is the work of Christ in us, and that's the work of Christ in all of creation. So we can't complete any of that. So what we do is just live faithfully as representatives. As ambassadors is one of the phrases that we love to use, that we are ambassadors to a different way. And that's incredibly important, because that different way imagery says that we aren't doing this in order necessarily to create anything, because we don't know that it will, right? Like we can act and live in peace and the end result can be our death. We can act and live in peace and the end result can be our suffering. We can act and live in peace and the end result can be more of that pain. The imagery says that we are actually representatives of a different way to be human. We are representatives of a totally different world, the kingdom of God. And so in that scenario, I'm not going out here saying the only reason I'm loving you is to somehow fix this stuff over here. Like, I'm loving you regardless of whether it gets fixed. You know, I'm loving you and I'm bringing peace regardless of whether or not any of this works right here and right now, because I represent something else, something beyond me. And I think it matters deeply, because then when we look at governments, that is the opposite of what a government can and even what should do. A government doesn't get to go out and say, we just represent a different way. The government simply says exactly the opposite. We have a goal in mind. Fix this, right? A government isn't allowed, at least a proper government, and I guess we'll talk about that more next time, but a proper government isn't allowed to say, yeah, we wanted to build a bridge, but oh, well, it fell down. Like, a proper government looks at it and says, did the bridge get built? Mm-hmm. And they do follow, there are rules of, hopefully, I mean, that's what we'll talk about how they're allowed to go about doing it. But they have an ends-based role that simply says we have to do that. And they can even create certain forms of peace. This is why that difference matters so clearly here. See, in Jesus's day, we had the most peaceful society the ancient Western world had ever seen. This is the thing that I think that we as Anabaptists don't realize. Jesus lived in the most peaceful era of that society that the Western world of the ancient Western world there had ever been a part of. Rome had created a society in which they had never seen, which the pathways, you could travel roads across the country. mostly free from being attacked by bandits. You could live, as long as you followed their laws, you could live in relative peace, with war being a distant idea compared to a normal part of life over and over and over again in society. But Rome did this by holding a sword to everyone's throat. And they can do it because if you do that, you can make everyone put their hands down and keeps peace. But that creating that ends by that means is totally opposite to the Christian faith. See, for the Christian then, we could commit ourselves to saying we will act in peace even if it doesn't keep your hands down. Mm-hmm. I will act in peace even if you still choose to put them up. And that is a completely different method. And governments are incapable of that because that moves outside of their definition.
Awesome. Thank you. That's the last of the questions.
Great. Well, I can say we moved quicker through some of these, mostly because the first section didn't really have any questions and I expected several more. So what I want to do is highlight a little of what we're going to talk about in the next one so that you can be prepared, as well as give you one more opportunity to throw out any questions you may have. And this is the chance, especially if anything I've said has made you say, I don't agree, let me know. Mennonites have especially in written functions, it seems, are way less likely to actually put out there like, you're wrong. But I'm really comfortable with that because that's where the good conversation comes from. So feel free to throw it out there and we'll bat it around. But in these next week, what I want to, or this next time we meet, I want to make sure that we go through these ideas. So let me throw this up here for you. In relation to what we've talked about. With this in mind, how can we be involved in politics? And this is a twofold question, right? This is the power of the English language. One is just, of course, like how is this possible? How is this even possible as Christians? And the other one is specifically right there of what is the method by which we can be involved. Secondarily, if we can't hold governments to Christian standards, and since our Christian standards include nonviolence and non-coercion, it should be clear by now that I believe strongly that we cannot hold them to Christian standards. To what standards can we hold them? And lastly, and this is going to be why I want, even if you disagree completely, to stick around, why I want you to stay all the way to the end, is how can Anabaptist Christians agree on theology, but disagree on politics? And so often right now, I hear essentially from people who are involved in conversations with their family or friends, and oftentimes online, unfortunately, that it can become really hard to actually be in relationship with people who disagree on these political issues, even though they seem to agree on their theology. And I'm hoping that at the end of this, at the end of these 3 weeks, you will have a way to go forward yourself, that even though you can't guarantee how anyone else is thinking, that you will be able to engage those people as wholly real people with real legitimate political opinions, even when they disagree with you, and followers of Jesus. Now, it's entirely possible that some of the people, no, it's not just possible, it's true. And yeah, it's true. There are a bunch of people in our churches and churches across the United States who, when it comes to their political discussions, they're not actually looking for the Jesus way at all. They've got political ideas that they just want to see played out, and Jesus is just gets tacked on at the end. This probably won't help that much. This is a conversation for, if we want to put Christ at the center, what do we do next? There's not much you can do if there's a political, or at least from a Christian perspective, there's not much you can do. If you want to say there is a political position that's right at the center, and Jesus is just on the periphery of that, that becomes a whole nother discussion, and we're only going to touch on that lightly just because some of the overlap. This is going to be anchored toward how do we actually do this as followers of Christ? How can we see other ways of going forward that don't align, that I don't agree with, but are totally possible? Mm-hmm. You will, when we start moving into that conversation, you will absolutely hear ideas that you disagree with, and we will talk about political opinions from across the spectrum. I want to say both now, and I will remind you multiple times next time, You have not heard my political ideas. You don't know my political ideas still. And I've gotten pretty good at maneuvering this conversation so that if you think you know them, you're probably wrong. So don't assume that if you think you know, you pinned me down on my political opinions, that you're right, because usually that just means you're mad at me. It usually means I got you down. I know what your political opinions are, and they're wrong. And that's not the case. So try to assume that as soon as you feel like you got it, that it's wrong, and that'll hopefully help you have the conversation better. One of the things that I want to leave you with then for a perspective, during this week, pay attention to this question, or this next month, pay attention to this question. Do I think, so for asking yourself, do I think my political opinions are right? Now, it's an easy question, because if you hold those political opinions, then the answer should be yes. If you didn't think they were right, then you wouldn't hold them. Now, hold for a moment what it's like. Now, this can feel a little bit like a sophomoric exercise, like something that happens in college at 2 a.m. when someone isn't sleeping and thinks they're getting real deep into some psychology of humans. But the reality is that everyone as a unique individual sits inside their own head in the same way and says, I'm right. You've never run into someone who has a political opinion at all who thinks they're wrong. If that doesn't give you a moment to sit back and say, there's a divergence in what we align with the faith in Christ and somehow how this plays out politically. Like, if there isn't some sort of divergence there, then the only option is exactly what we've been given so far, which is that then everyone other than you, or at least everyone who doesn't fit into your camp, is not Christian. And I don't think you're here for that answer. So think about that as you go through this next month. And I'm not sure what this last little bit here is, but I'd be happy to answer it since we have a little bit of time.
Actually, I was going to try to interrupt you and ask this very same question. How do you define political, and do you equate government with politics?
Yes and no. Those are not the same thing, and they sometimes can sound like they're interchangeable. I'm probably gonna avoid. Well, here's the thing: we can be political outside of our governments, and we have political engagement in our own denominations. Any kind of institutional structure has a political engagement. It's a way of defining boundaries of human interaction. Mm-hmm. It's not that important for this conversation. They do tend to merge together, because the main point of this conversation is: are we active with an institution that utilizes force? So when I say political engagement, I am directly saying government action that uses force. So unfortunately, I hope that doesn't mess anyone up, because I do conflate them in the way that I talk about them, even though they are separate. But that's how it's being used in this conversation.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was just thinking, like, in our confession of faith, it just declares the church as a spiritual, social, and political body, right? That's
right. And part of that, the simple answer to that is that when we declare Jesus is Lord, that is a political declaration, because it says we have an authority that is over us and we are committed to it. And it's up against any other political authority. If it's done well, then Jesus is Lord, and that means no one else is, regardless of whether you like them.
And that shapes the way that we construct our common life together as community.
Right, and so it moves past. It shouldn't just be limited to government. The conversation of what that is politically, it does, exactly. Well, you said it perfectly right there, Michael. It shapes the way we live our lives together as community.
A couple more questions popped up, actually. So why do you think that for many of us, the lure of national politics is more attractive to engage with than church congregational politics?
Power. I'm going to flat out say it. Like, I believe it's because it's big and powerful, and that I don't think we're lured to engage, hold that power. I don't think that's for many people that's what it is. It's just that power has a greater conversation for us. That sway, even though, I had this conversation when someone was asking about this webinar is this going to get involved, or is this going to go into the conversation of local politics, because that has a bigger impact on most people's daily lives. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, we'll talk about that again next week. But for for the most part, the reason why people don't realize that is because the way that the conversation always exists is where are the big, literally the big guns? Like, where is the big power sources? And those things seem most relevant to us.
Mm-hmm.
I would also argue that, I don't know, we have charismatic leaders in politics because that's how they get to the top. And we're more interested in what they can do. We also are often more interested in how we can define ourselves against things than for things. And if a church is doing its job well, it's going to be a little bit different than that because it's going to be, what is it for? So as we define ourselves well, I would argue it's hard to convince people to get as excited about it, is because we would rather be tribes with enemies. And political bodies, parties, they define themselves with enemies. I don't know. That's something I would love to answer that question over coffee for a long period of time, because that's a big conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The last question that's popped up is, what is your definition of violence?
Right. So that's an important one, because violence, particularly now, we have a terminology that's really wide. And I find that while there are all sorts of times where widening the definition of violence can be really helpful to give weight to all sorts of things that happen in our lives, in this scenario, you widen that too much and you lose the real clear description of directed harm at individuals. Now, I don't want to just say it's physical violence as opposed to like mental violence or other types of violence that are out there, because they do exist, obviously. But this is a directed harm in a particular way that is not the same as I would even call incidental harm, which is not free from morality. It's just not the same thing. So in some ways, we have to limit that. This is more classically defined violence, in that there is force and coercion involved in it, that you can't step away from it no matter what you want. Yeah, that's a great question because of that limitation. In many ways, our cultural conversation around violence can get so big that I couldn't approach that in this one without spending half the time defining that. So we're going to keep it fairly narrow.
Derek says if you're ever in Kansas, he'll take you up on that coffee.
I'd be happy to.
You know which Derek that is, I think.
I like this this scenario here. It looks like I just found the chat piece. Concern attracted to the radical Reformation. Did you read that, Michael?
Okay, so I missed that one. That one snuck in over. Okay. All right, I'll put my biggest concern out there. I'm deeply attracted to radical Reformation's political theology and to the belief that God is saving and will save the world, not through the centers of power, but these alternative communities on the fringes that make up the church. But my biggest fear is that this has not proven to be true. Perhaps our best example of nonviolent Christian intervention making a positive impact on the social challenges faced by Americans in the past century is the civil rights movement by MLK Jr., but he too was a follower of Niebuhr, and he did not seek to change society through consensus, but by changing the law. Is it realistic to hope we can make an impact without that? Is it naive or irresponsible to deny this?
Right. I don't know about naive or irresponsible. Those are judgments I don't want to make too simply. You're right about MLK and Niebuhr, but here's the thing. If you go in that time, other than people who are extreme on either the theological left or right, everyone loved Niebuhr. So it wasn't that uncommon. Like the MLK liked Niebuhr, and people who disagreed with MLK liked Niebuhr. The guy made it on Time magazine, and how many theologians get to be on Time magazine? So it's not at all uncommon. Anyone who was involved in the political conversation of the day kind of loved Niebuhr, which is really weird because like he was at one point a socialist, and he was like anti-socialist, and why people in different camps land there. I mean, for me, it's because it gave them as far as I can tell, he gave them a way to say your Christian faith can be active in government, but government can still do its role, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm doing the same thing, but I'm going to talk about it in a very different way. Yeah, I would say this distinction. I don't know. We need to talk more, Brian. We might need to talk more a personal conversation as opposed to for everyone to hear on this, because it depends on what you're drawn to about it. The transformative power of communities that commit themselves to nonviolence and to a Jesus-centered nonviolence, to the idea of that we are submitted to the lordship of Christ in that. This is a sort of power under that the transformation is purely a matter of actual, I guess you could use the word conversion, but it's really commitment, right? It's faithfulness. That transformation can never be societal in the sense of structures that are put in place to force people into it. It has to be Holy Spirit driven. And so I do believe in the power of that to make transformation. But I also believe that the image that Christ says is that like we're basically never free from the pressure of society to change that way, that we're never going to be free from the pressure of society to give up on nonviolence and to give up on non-coercion and to give up on the invitational choice. I think that that's a reality. And I don't know that we're ever going to overcome that and somehow convince everyone that they should do it outside of convincing them to submit to Christ in some way and to find their identity then in Jesus and Jesus' kingdom. That is absolutely an Anabaptist perspective. And I'm not going to deny that it is clearly one that is tied to my pastoral role of desiring everyone to find their faith in Christ. But I'm just not convinced that society will ever, or even that Christ believed that we could create some sort of kingdom of God on earth through these institutions of power. Because of the nature of fallen powers, I feel like they will always be that way. I think that's the theology that we see in the Anabaptist tradition, and I think that's what Jesus is kind of pointing toward is that this stuff just stays fallen, and what you're trying to do is within that brokenness point to something else.
So you have another date. Brian wants to have a longer conversation with you outside of this, but I do agree that to your point, it says mass incarceration phase of systemic racism may suggest that changing the law was not enough to uproot the problem.
Right, and that's going to continue, and you're going to find this out in the conversations as we go forward. I've been accused of saying like that this conversation is saying we don't need to do anything and we don't need to take action because government is bad and is always bad, and that's not what I'm saying at all. What I want to make sure is that before we can move forward with what can we do, we recognize that government will never be free of acting with violence. As long as we can get that done and clarify what government is doing in these actions, we can stop patting ourselves on the back and be like that our participation was actively Jesus in these systems. Jesus would point toward the good, probably like seek the good, but also condemn the consistent use of violence. And yes, that means systemic racism, issues of mass incarceration. I don't want to go too far into this at all, but it is totally within the Anabaptist frame to say we should act. We should act in changing certain things for the role of government, and that's what we're going to get into next. But we should act to change those things. At the same time, recognize that we're probably going to mess it up. Like at the same time, recognize that whatever we come up with, it's going to be great. Like whenever we say like, oh, we've got the answer, of course we do. And in 50 years, we're going to look back and say, we did not have the answer. But that doesn't mean we don't do anything. It doesn't mean we don't do anything. But it should put us humbly back in the position to say part of the reason why we don't have the answer is that we are working with a system that's fallen and will always be that way and will always do things that are anti-Christ, no matter how hard we try against it. And so whatever we do is going to find a way to be messed up. That doesn't, again, good governments, bad governments, and we're going to go way more into that again later, but these things exist. There are better versions and worse versions, but none of them are free from violence, coercion, and none of them are free from being anti-Christ. That is, their entire methodology is anti-Christ.